Let's all raise a glass to Patricia, my nephew said, smiling as he stood at the head of the Thanksgiving table. None of us would be where we are today without her. The room filled with applause. Warm smiles spread across familiar faces. Glasses lifted into the air. Everyone was looking at my sister as if she were the architect of a success story that had changed our family's life. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The woman they were applauding had never built any of it. My name is Grace Bennett. I'm 67 years old, and for more than 25 years, I poured my heart into building a business from the ground up. I worked before sunrise and long after sunset. I signed every loan application. I met every payroll. I spent weekends in a tiny office while other people were enjoying vacations and family gatherings. There were years when I barely paid myself because I wanted the company to survive. Yet somehow, on that Thanksgiving evening, it felt as though my entire life had been rewritten. Patricia sat in the center of the room wearing a cream-colored sweater and a smile that seemed just a little too comfortable. She accepted every compliment with graceful nods. She thanked people for their kind words. She laughed softly when someone called her an inspiration. Not once did she correct them. Not once did she mention my name. The smell of roasted turkey filled the dining room. Candles flickered across the poly. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and familiar traditions. Plates were cleared. Pumpkin pie was served. Children drifted into the living room to watch football while the adults lingered around the dining table. I smiled when expected and answered questions when spoken to, but my mind kept returning to the same unsettling realization. Somehow, over the years, the story of my life had changed without me noticing. When I finally drove home that night, the roads were quiet. Most families were still gathered around fireplaces and dessert trays, enjoying the warmth of the holiday. I turned onto the narrow country road leading to my house and watched. The headlights sweep across bare trees and wooden fences. The company headquarters sat less than 10 miles away. I had passed that building thousands of times. Every brick seemed connected to a memory. Every window reminded me of a sacrifice. Yet sitting behind the steering wheel, I wondered how many people now believed I had merely been standing on the sidelines while someone else built it. Sleep did not come easily. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at an old framed photograph hanging near the pantry door. It showed me at 42 years old during the opening of our second office location. I was wearing a navy business suit and holding an oversized ceremonial ribbon before the grand opening. Standing beside me was Patricia. Looking at the photograph now, I noticed something strange. Most people would assume she was the one in charge. She stood confidently in the center while I remained slightly off to the side. Back then, I never cared about attention. I believed the work mattered more than recognition. Patricia was different. She always enjoyed being the center of every room. The next morning, I opened an old storage closet in my home office. Inside were dozens of boxes filled with documents, photographs, notebooks, and company records spanning decades. I had not looked through them in years. Dust covered the lids. The labels had faded with time. As I pulled one box onto the floor, memories came rushing back. There were photographs from trade shows, copies of original business plans, handwritten notes from late-night strategy sessions, and newspaper clippings from the early years. Every piece told the same story. I had lived it. Yet the version being celebrated at Thanksgiving sounded completely different. Around noon, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed my mother's number. Evelyn rarely called first. Usually, family members reached out to her. I answered immediately. Her voice sounded calm, but unusually serious. "Grace," she said softly, "I need you to come see me." I glanced at the stack of old records spread across my desk. "Is everything all right, Mom?" There was a brief pause. Then she answered with a sentence that sent a chill through me. "There are some things you deserve to know, and I think I should have told you years ago." I arrived at my mother's house just after 2 o'clock that afternoon. The familiar white farmhouse looked exactly as it had for decades. The porch swing still hung near the front steps. Wind chimes stirred gently in the cool autumn breeze. Everything appeared ordinary, yet the uneasiness I had carried since Thanksgiving only seemed to grow stronger. Evelyn was waiting for me in the kitchen. A pot of coffee sat on the table between us, untouched. She looked smaller than I remembered, but there was a steadiness in her eyes that immediately caught my attention. After I sat down, Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she folded her hands and looked directly at me. "You have always been too willing to let other people stand in the spotlight," she said quietly. I forced a small smile. "I never cared much about attention." "I know," she replied. "That is exactly why this happened." Her words settled heavily between us. I felt my chest tighten. "What happened, Mom?" Evelyn stood slowly and walked toward a hallway closet. A moment later, she returned carrying a faded cardboard box. The corners were worn. The tape had yellowed with age. She placed it carefully on the table as though it contained something fragile. "I have been keeping this for a very long time." I stared at the box. "What is it?" "Proof." The single word made my pulse quicken. Evelyn opened the lid. Inside were dozens of folders, photographs, letters, and notebooks. At first glance, they looked like ordinary family keepsakes. Then I recognized several documents immediately. They were from the earliest days of my company. Original business plans, loan applications, contracts bearing my signature. There were photographs of me meeting with suppliers and attending trade conferences years before the company became successful. There were handwritten notes outlining growth strategies and expansion plans. Everything had dates. Everything had records. Everything pointed to the same undeniable truth. I looked up at my mother. "Why have you kept all of this?" Evelyn sighed softly. "Because I saw what was happening." I felt a chill run through me. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before answering. Little by little, Patricia started changing the story. At first it seemed harmless. A comment here, a memory there. She would tell people she helped more than she really did. Then years passed, and the stories became bigger. I listened without interrupting. Most people never questioned it. Evelyn continued. The younger generation only heard Patricia's version. Eventually they accepted it as fact. My eyes drifted back to the documents spread across the table. I remembered creating every one of them. I remembered the sacrifices behind every page. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked quietly. My mother's expression softened. "Because I thought the truth would eventually speak for itself." She looked down at the box and gently touched one of the folders. I was wrong. Then she reached deeper into the box and removed a sealed envelope. Unlike everything else, this one had never been opened. Written across the front in her careful handwriting were 4 words that immediately made my heart race. "For Thanksgiving dinner only." That night, after Wade and Romy went upstairs, I remained alone in the living room long after the grandfather clock struck 10. The house was quiet, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet Noelle and I had once shared. This silence felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat in Noelle's favorite armchair and looked around the room we had built together over 3 decades. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every scratch on the hardwood floor carried a memory. My eyes drifted to the framed picture above the fireplace. It had been taken during our 25th wedding anniversary. Noelle stood beside me with one arm around my shoulders, smiling that steady smile that had always made me feel safe. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Then memories began returning one after another. Noelle had never been a man of grand speeches. He showed love through small things. Every winter morning, he warmed up my car before I left for work. Every summer, he planted flowers beneath the front porch because he knew how much I loved seeing color outside the kitchen window. When something broke, he fixed it before I even had the chance to worry. And whenever life became difficult, he always said the same thing. "As long as we stand together, nobody can push us aside." The memory struck harder than I expected. I rose slowly and walked toward our bedroom. Opening the closet, I found one of his old jackets still hanging exactly where he had left it. I ran my fingers across the sleeve and felt tears gathering for the first time since the funeral. Not because I was weak, but because I suddenly understood how much of my strength had come from knowing he was beside me. Inside the dresser drawer sat a small wooden box. Noelle had kept letters, receipts, photographs, and keepsakes there for years. I opened it carefully. Near the bottom was a birthday card he had given me 5 years earlier. His handwriting was neat and familiar. I unfolded the card and read the message again. He had written that this house was more than wood and brick. It was the proof of a lifetime built together. He wrote that no matter what happened, it would always be my home as much as his. I sat on the edge of the bed holding that card in both hands. The words blurred through my tears. Suddenly, the conversation at dinner felt even colder. Wade had spoken as though I had merely occupied the house. as though my life with Noelle had been some temporary arrangement. But Noelle had never seen me that way. Not once. For 32 years, we had made every decision together. We had sacrificed together. We had worked overtime, skipped vacations, and saved every extra dollar to build security for our family. The home existed because both of us had poured our lives into it. That realization settled something deep inside me. The grief remained. The betrayal remained. But beneath them, another feeling slowly emerged. Determination. Noelle was gone, and I missed him with every breath. Yet the values he spent a lifetime teaching me were still here. I carefully folded the card and placed it back into the wooden box. Then I looked around the room one more time. For the first time since that terrible dinner, I stopped feeling like a helpless widow being pushed aside. Instead, I felt like the woman Noelle had trusted for more than 3 decades. And somehow, that made all the difference. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then reality settled over me again. Noelle was gone. Wade and Romy wanted me out of the house. The future I had always imagined had disappeared almost overnight. I made a pot of coffee and carried my mug to the kitchen table. The sky outside was still gray. The neighborhood was quiet. In the past, this was the hour Noelle and I enjoyed most. We would sit together, reading the newspaper and planning simple things like grocery trips or weekend projects. Now there was only silence. As I stared out the window, my phone rang. The name on the screen surprised me. It was Helen, one of Noelle's oldest friends. We had known her and her husband for more than 20 years. I almost let the call go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. Her voice softened immediately when she heard mine. She asked how I was managing and whether I needed anything. For the first time in days, someone sounded genuinely concerned. We spoke for nearly 30 minutes. I did not tell her everything at first. I was embarrassed. Saying the words out loud would make them real. But eventually the truth came out. I told her about the dinner. I told her what Romy had said. I told her how Wade had simply agreed. The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds. Then Helen sighed heavily. Noelle would never have allowed that, she said quietly. Hearing someone else say his name nearly broke me. Before ending the call, she mentioned something unexpected. A few months before his death, Noelle had met with an attorney. Helen knew because her husband had driven him to one of the appointments after a minor car repair had left Noelle without transportation. The information immediately caught my attention. Noelle had never mentioned an attorney appointment to me, at least not that I could remember. Helen could not tell me why he had gone. She only knew it had happened more than once. After we hung up, I sat motionless at the table. My mind began replaying memories from the last year. There had been several afternoons when Noelle returned home carrying folders and documents. Whenever I asked about them, he would smile and say he was organizing things so I would never have to worry. At the time, I assumed he meant retirement paperwork or insurance forms. Now I was not so sure. For the first time since the nightmare began, a small crack appeared in the wall of despair surrounding me. It was not hope exactly. Not yet. But it was curiosity. Questions I had been too overwhelmed to ask suddenly felt important. Why had Noelle met with an attorney? What documents had he been organizing? And why had he seemed so determined to reassure me that I would always be protected? I finished my coffee and looked toward the hallway. Upstairs, Wade and Romy were still asleep. They believed the next 2 weeks would unfold exactly as they planned. Sitting there in the quiet kitchen, I began to wonder if they might be mistaken. Later that afternoon, I drove to the small office building Helen had mentioned. The attorney's name sounded familiar the moment the receptionist said it. I remembered Noelle mentioning him years ago when we updated some insurance paperwork. My hands felt unusually cold as I sat in the waiting area. Family photographs decorated the walls. The kind of photographs that reminded people why they planned for the future in the first place. After a short wait, the attorney stepped into the lobby and greeted me warmly. His expression changed when he realized why I had come. He invited me into his office and closed the door behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he opened a file cabinet and carefully removed a thick folder with Noelle's name printed across the tab. Seeing my husband's name written there made my chest tighten. The attorney explained that Noelle had visited several times during the previous year. According to him, Noelle had become increasingly concerned about making sure everything would be organized if something happened unexpectedly. That sounded exactly like Noelle. He had always prepared for problems long before they arrived. The attorney could not immediately discuss Specific details because certain documents required formal procedures before release. Still, he confirmed something important. Noel had left very clear instructions regarding his estate, the house, and several financial matters. As I listened, I felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Relief because Noel had not left things unfinished. Confusion because Wade and Romy had spoken with such confidence. They had acted as though ownership of the house was already settled. Before leaving, I scheduled another appointment for later that week. The attorney promised to gather everything necessary so we could review the documents properly. When I walked back to my car, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in days. Not because my problems had disappeared. They had not. But for the first time since Noel's funeral, facts were beginning to replace assumptions. That evening, I returned home to find Romy sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through furniture websites. She barely looked up when I entered. Wade was beside her reviewing photographs of remodeled bedrooms. They stopped talking the moment they saw me. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Then Romy smiled. It was the same practice smile she used whenever she wanted something. She asked whether I had started sorting my belongings yet. I told her I was still deciding what to do. Her expression tightened for a fraction of a second before the smile returned. Wade avoided eye contact again. I noticed something then. Neither of them asked where I had been all afternoon. Neither seemed interested in how I was coping. Their attention remained fixed on plans that depended entirely upon my departure. That realization hurt. But it also clarified something. The people sitting in that kitchen were already imagining a future inside this house. Meanwhile, I was beginning to discover that Noel may have imagined a very different future altogether. And somewhere between those two visions, the truth was waiting. 2 days later, I returned to the attorney's office carrying a notebook and a determination I had not felt since before Noel died. The folder waiting on his desk seemed thicker than I remembered. He invited me to sit down and carefully began reviewing the documents Noel had prepared. Every page revealed the same thing. My husband had thought about the future in extraordinary detail. He had not left important decisions to chance. He had anticipated complications. He had organized everything with the same careful attention he once used when repairing a leaky roof or balancing the household budget. As the attorney explained the structure of the estate, a pattern became clear. Noel had established protections designed specifically to ensure I would remain financially secure. Several assets had been arranged in ways that could not simply be transferred based on assumptions or demands. The attorney paused several times to answer my questions. With each answer, I felt a little steadier. Not because I was thinking about money. What mattered most was understanding that Noel had kept his promise. Even in death, he had tried to protect me. Before I left, the attorney handed me copies of several documents and encouraged me to review them carefully at home. He also suggested that I avoid making any major decisions until every detail had been fully examined. I appreciated that advice. For the first time in weeks, I felt no urgency to rush. When I arrived home, I found several cardboard boxes stacked near the front hallway. My stomach tightened. I knew immediately who had placed them there. Sure enough, Romy appeared from the kitchen and casually explained that she thought the boxes might help me begin packing. Her voice was cheerful, but the message underneath was unmistakable. Wade stood nearby pretending to check messages on his phone. He never looked directly at me. I thanked her politely and carried the documents upstairs without another word. Inside my bedroom, I closed the door and sat beside the window. The boxes downstairs bothered me less than they would have a few days earlier. Back then, they represented defeat. Now they represented impatience. Romy and Wade were behaving as though the outcome had already been decided. They were planning renovations, discussing room layouts, and imagining a future that belonged entirely to them. Yet neither of them had seen the papers sitting beside me on the bed. Neither of them knew what Noel had spent months preparing. That evening, I overheard fragments of conversation drifting from the kitchen. Romy was discussing paint colors. Wade mentioned converting Noel's workshop into a nursery someday. Their words floated through the house like distant echoes. I listened quietly from the hallway. What surprised me most was not their confidence. It was their certainty. They never once questioned whether they might be wrong. I returned to my room and placed the documents inside the wooden box where Noel kept his most important memories. Then I looked at our anniversary photograph again. This time, instead of grief, I felt something else. Patience. The truth was no longer hidden. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The following week moved slowly. Every day felt like a careful test of patience. I continued my normal routines. I watered the flowers Noelle had planted years ago. I cleaned the kitchen. I folded laundry. On the surface, nothing seemed different. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, everything had changed. Wade and Romy grew increasingly comfortable discussing their plans in front of me. One evening, while preparing dinner, I overheard Romy talking about replacing the living room furniture. Another afternoon, she measured the guest bedroom walls and mentioned turning the space into a home office. Neither conversation included me. It was as though I had already disappeared from the house. Surprisingly, that no longer filled me with panic. Instead, I found myself observing them the way someone studies a puzzle. Their confidence came entirely from assumptions. They believed they understood Noelle's intentions. They believed they knew what belonged to them. Most of all, they believed I would quietly accept whatever future they had chosen for me. One afternoon, Helen stopped by with a container of homemade soup. We sat together on the back porch overlooking the garden. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves. For the first time since Noelle's death, I found myself smiling during a conversation. Not because life had become easy, but because someone still treated me like a person instead of an obstacle. Before she left, Helen squeezed my hand and reminded me that truth has a way of revealing itself when people become too certain of their own version of events. Her words stayed with me long after she drove away. That evening, I received a call from the attorney. He informed me that several final steps had been completed and that a formal meeting would be scheduled within days. The moment I hung up, I felt my pulse quicken. The waiting period was nearly over. The uncertainty that had surrounded me since that terrible dinner was beginning to lift. Later that night, I passed the kitchen and noticed Wade sitting alone at the table. For the first time in weeks, he looked troubled. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes seemed distant. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the expression on his face when Romy told me to pack my bags. I remembered how easily he had agreed. How quickly he had dismissed 32 years of marriage and sacrifice. He looked up as I walked past and opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something. But no words came. I simply nodded and continued upstairs. In my bedroom, I opened the wooden box once more. The documents rested beside Noelle's letters and photographs. Everything was ready. I stood at the window looking out across the backyard where Wade used to play as a child. So many years had passed in this house. So many memories had been built here. Soon, assumptions would collide with reality. And for the first time since Noelle's funeral, I felt completely calm about what would happen next. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. I slept surprisingly well the night before. Not because I expected a victory, but because uncertainty no longer controlled me. When dawn arrived, I dressed carefully and drove to the attorney's office. The sky was clear. The roads were quiet. Everything felt strangely ordinary for a day that might change the course of several lives. When I arrived, the conference room was already prepared. A long table stood in the center. Several folders rested neatly beside glasses of water. I took my seat and waited. 20 minutes later, Wade and Romy entered together. The moment they saw me, surprise flashed across their faces. Neither had expected me to be there. Romy recovered first. She smiled politely and asked why I had come. I simply told her that I had been invited. The attorney entered before either of them could respond. What followed was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no arguments, no emotional speeches. Instead, there were documents, facts, signatures, dates. The attorney began explaining Noelle's estate plan in careful detail. As he spoke, I watched Wade's expression slowly change. At first he seemed confident, then confused, then increasingly uncomfortable. Several times he interrupted with questions. Each time the attorney calmly referred back to the documents Noelle had signed. The house, which Wade and Romy had already begun treating as their future property, was protected through arrangements Noelle had established long before his death. Certain decisions required my approval. Certain assets remained under my control. Most importantly, Noelle had left explicit instructions that my housing security could not be compromised by anyone else's wishes. The room grew very quiet. Romy's posture stiffened. Wade stared down at the table. For several seconds, nobody spoke. I thought back to that dinner, to the way they had discussed my future without asking what I wanted, to the cardboard boxes waiting in the hallway. to the renovations they had planned while I was still grieving. Suddenly, those memories no longer felt painful. They felt distant. The attorney continued reviewing additional documents. Each one reinforced the same message. Noel had anticipated problems. He had taken steps to prevent them. He had trusted me. By the end of the meeting, the confidence Wade and Romy had carried into the room had disappeared completely. Neither looked angry. They looked stunned, as though the future they had imagined had dissolved right in front of them. When the attorney finally finished, silence settled across the room once more. I gathered my papers carefully and placed them into my folder. Then I stood. Nobody stopped me. Nobody argued. I walked toward the door, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Behind me, Wade quietly called my name. I paused but did not turn around immediately. For the first time since Noel's funeral, he sounded uncertain. And for the first time since that terrible dinner, I realized the balance of power in the room had completely changed.